Hey everyone, today we're going to build this storage bench with a sheet of plywood and a couple pieces of Home Depot lumber that should only cost you a few bucks. And bonus points if you want to make it have some board and batten wrapping here, as well as a padded top. Also has storage for your wife's photography needs. Well, my wife's.
So we're going to need 4 full-length 2x4s to build the skeleton of this bench. So I went with these guys at my local Home Depot because they were straight-ish. The overall dimensions of this bench are going to be 43.5 inches long. So we're going to build it to about 17 inches tall, but adjust for what you need. All right, let's get into our space and start assembling. And here's all of the cuts that we need to make for the base on screen here, and we can get them from 4 of our 2x4s. We're in the middle of renovating our condo that we bought this year while we're living in it, which complicates things sometimes. But as you can see, this area has just kind of become a catch-all for scraps and anything long, and we want to be able to sit around the table. And like I said earlier, this is storage for my wife's camera gear, and since we live in a condo, storage space is a super valuable commodity, but it's also a problem that needs to be solved constantly. Building things sometimes has to be done inside, which I wouldn't recommend, but it's currently 12 degrees outside, and there's about 12 inches of snow on the ground, so I don't have the ability to go outside and make cuts.
Speaking of cutting inside, you'll notice that I'm cutting on this table. That's a furniture flip waiting to happen, so you should subscribe so you don't miss what I'm going to do with that, because I'm really excited about it.
So starting with the base is always a good idea. So let's take 2 of these 43.5 inch pieces and get them attached to 4 of our 16-inch pieces. So clamps aren't necessary, but they are helpful if you don't have any friends. Putting this together, I'm going to be using a mix of screwing through and then also using some pocket holes for some of those tighter areas where a few pieces are coming together. But for the bottom here, we're just coming in through the sides because that is going to be a much stronger joint. Make sure you're checking for square as you go by using a carpenter's square and measuring diagonally from corner to corner and checking your angles.
So now we're going to put the rest of those 15-inch spaces down below at about 12.5 inches apart from each other. So we have a nice, good little skeleton going on here. After this, we're going to do the same thing with the top piece and those other 43.5 inch pieces and the last 2 of the 15-inch pieces that we're going to do at just the ends, and forget about the spacing in the middle because we will save that for when we get to the lid of the piece.
Now, these 10-inch pieces are going to get pocket holes, which is fine because there's so many of them and they'll be acting as jack studs. So the weight is vertical. Gravity is your friend in this situation. Next, we're going to fasten the top section together and then use the pocket holes to attach it to the supports.
As you can see, things got a little tight in the corner, so you may have to also crank down on some of these screws using a regular screwdriver.
I cut these 2-inch sections for the corners and we'll attach these in the bottom corners so that it will hold up the bottom piece of plywood or hardboard or whatever you end up using for the base of the storage section.
Now I'm thinking about this as part 2. We're getting to the exterior of the cabinet. I'm going to wrap this using 3 pieces of pre-sanded plywood because 2x4 flip boards of it happen to be on sale. Then for the bottom shelf, I'm using a piece of hardboard that was only about $7. You also have options here, and I would recommend MDF if it's going to be painted, as this is the most affordable option and it takes paint really well. But if you want something that's going to survive a few bangs, or if you have kids, then some sanded plywood is your other more affordable option, although that's going to take a little bit more work to get a smoother finish. To cut this down, you can use a table saw if you have one, or I'm using a Kreg jig here that will adapt a circular saw onto a Kreg track so that you can use it similarly to a track saw. It also works with Kreg's rip cut jig for cutting down longer sheets of plywood and making rip cuts that are repeatable. This is a good option if you only have a circular saw. One thing to know though is that Kreg's track is proprietary and doesn't like to work with the other industry standards. So other jigs, clamps, etc. usually won't work. So if you're like me and want to work with hardwoods one day and buy a real track saw, then you're going to have to sell your tracks and jigs and switch over if you buy something other than Kreg's. Here, I'm Googling the track saws I want and crying due to a lack of hardwood projects that I can do because I believe that I would kill this circular saw if I tried to cut walnut or something like that. Anyways, At this point, take your measurements from the project itself because things will never be perfect when using framing lumber. So I cut this hardboard down to size and dry fit it before coming back and hitting it with some 18 gauge brad nails. You can use screws, you can use glue, you can use nails, you can use all four of them if you want. It's up to you, it's your project. I started with my longest piece here and ripped it to size for the exterior and then cross cut it to length. And I gave myself about 3/16 of an inch extra, and you'll see why in a minute. And I did the same on the other side. Now I cut the two short outside edges exactly to length and dry fit them all together. And that creates a butt joint on the outside corners by splitting the overhang on the long edges so that the short edges would fit snug in there and flush. And then I used some more brad nails to fasten it all together. Don't worry, these ugly joints are going to be covered by the trim in the next step. Now, this is part 3, and it's time to focus on the trim work. I happen to have a piece of scrap MDF, but you can also grab a project board for about $25 to $30 at Lowe's or Home Depot that will fit nicely in your trunk. I hate working with MDF so much because it gets so dusty and it gets everywhere. So please wear your respirator when cutting it and do not cut it inside your house. Now, I'm going to use my table saw to rip this down to 1¼ inch sections because that's the dimension that matches the board and batten and the cabinet rails and stiles that's already in our house. Then I'm going to use my miter saw and cut my long edges to length using the measurements from each step of the top and the bottom long edges. Like I said before, take your measurements off the project at this point in case you're slightly out of square. We're going to be mitering outside corners on these 45-degree angles from our measurement, so sneak up on these is my advice, and then go back and forth until you get them where you want them. Then I'm going to do the same for the shorter rails on the side. Pro move here is to line up your corners and use some shims to get them at an even height so that they meet up nice. I like these shims because they aren't wedge shape. They're a nice little pack I bought on Amazon, and they're consistent heights. Now for trimming up these tall corners, this is going to be the most advanced thing we'll do in this video. And I'm setting my table saw to a 45-degree angle, and we're going to rip cut the remaining 2¼ inch sections with a 45-degree angle running the length of it. So take your time, literally don't cut your corners, measure a trillion times, and practice dialing it in on a scrap piece. And use a push block to keep pressure down onto the table and up against your fence. You can do everything I'm about to show you with your circular saw and a rip cut jig, but I feel like it's so much safer to use the table saw for this. And I know that a table saw can be scary, so if you have a friend with one, ask them to help you make the cuts you need. Just please be safe out there. Now we're gonna cut everything to length on the miter saw using a 90-degree angle. And if you didn't get the inside edge perfect, that's okay. You can use a utility knife to cope out the intersections for a tighter joint. Mine happened to be 12½ inches, so I cut 8 pieces down to that size. So get these lined up and nail them in. Your joints don't have to be perfect here, but they should be close, and try to make them consistent if there is a gap. This is a paint grade project, and the old adage, caulk and paint make a carpenter what they ain't, is going to help us out here, especially if this is your first time mitering corners. Here I'm taking another piece of our plywood, and this is 3/4 inch, and I am cutting it down to size to be our lid for the piece, and I'm gonna let it hang over about 3/4 inch on all sides. Using the inside dimensions of the box, I am going to cut some extra pieces of 2x4 here. Mark out on the top side where they're going to line up with a studs in the middle, and these are going to be our braces to keep our plywood from sinking in. However, I'm not going to attach them right here. I'm just going to dry fit them, make sure that they fit. Then I cut another smaller scrap piece of plywood, and I use the flat edge to use it as a bit of a catch for the bottom of these stretchers. This way, I'll attach the stretchers to the lid of our project, but then these little cleats here are going to catch it and prevent it from sagging in the middle so that we have a nice brace when we put our big fat butts on it. Here I'm putting the lid back on, making sure that everything fits and lines up the way that I want it. Then I'm going to come in with my brad nails and just sink 2 nails down into these cross braces here. Then I'm going to push it onto the ground. They're being held in temporarily by those brad nails, but we're going to jump on top of this, add some weight, and drive some screws into it.
In this video, you'll see that I'm using panhead screws, which in retrospect is not a great idea if you're going to put anything on the top of this because they won't sit flush. So I actually off camera came back in and used my countersink bit to make sure that my screws sit flush in here because I'm going to be attaching another piece on top of this that's going to hold our padded bench. Now we're going to test fit again, and everything is looking nice and snug, which is just what I want. Using my screwdriver, I broke the edges so they're not quite as sharp. Then I used some pre-mixed spackle and filled in any nail holes and voids. You can also cover the sides of your plywood if you don't want them to peek through your paint. Then I took them through the grits of 120, 180, and 220, specifically on the sides. MDF doesn't like to be sanded, so you should do that sparingly. In fact, I did most of the MDF sanding by hand, and I skipped right from 220. I went right to 180, just very briefly, and then right to 220. And here is how I got in the corners by wrapping a sand pad around a block of wood, and then you can very briefly and gently sand down those corners. MDF, if you sand it, it gets kind of fuzzy and it doesn't look as smooth anymore. You can't really come back from that if you overdo it. Here's what it looks like if you spackle the edges and want to sand it down. Just do it by hand very gently until you get a nice smooth finish on it. It's not going to be the most durable thing, but it looks better, in my opinion, than the unfinished edge of the plywood. And here is where I went with the final sanding just to knock everything down. That's about as much sanding as you need to do. If it's smooth to the touch, it should be paint finish smooth as well. Take a wet rag and wipe everything down so you get all that dust off of there before you start putting your primer on. For cabinets, I like these mohair rollers that I get at Sherwin-Williams, and I'm using some primer to put 2 coats on top of our box before we start painting. Now I'm going to do 1 coat, cutting in with my brush first around the corners, making everything smooth. Here, I'm using that mohair brush, and pet peeve of mine is when I see people paint in all different directions when they're rolling. That's going to give you a nasty finish, and you really want everything to dry kind of uniformly. And so you're going to need to follow the long edges on this in order to get a nice even coat, making sure that when you go over the top of it, you go over any of those kinds of overlap seams and smooth them all out. Then I am going to give this a quick hand sanding with 220 grit just to keep the finish looking smooth before we move on to our second coat of primer. But this prep in between coats really will differentiate your outcome from, something amateurish to something that looks a little bit more premium. Then we wipe it down again with a moist rag. And I move on to putting my caulk in at this stage. So I'm just using some quick drying caulk, and we're going to go in here, get a nice bead in there. I wear gloves because it's easier to work with. Make sure one of your fingers is wet and just get in there real nice and tight and smooth out that bead of caulk until it's looking nice and uniform. Then I come back in with my second coat of primer because this really needs that. It's thirsty. Now, I don't skip out on paint because paint is just something I'm a stickler about. I used to work as a painter, but I'm using the Benjamin Moore urethane finish, and I use this for cabinets, anything that's high traffic that gets a lot of cleaning. And so you could also use Benjamin Moore Aura for your cabinets and things like this, and it's matching some of our board and batten, which is the same finish. So we're just hitting it with a nice off-white here, making sure to go over in straight lines. Even pressure, making sure to roll the length of the project so that there is no seams. Don't go willy-nilly and roll up, down, left, right. Just keep it going one direction. There's a nice, I want you to have the best finish you can possibly have. So just make sure you're going entire lengths. Now, while that was driving, I went to go to Joann's Fabrics, but I guess that place closed down. And then I went over to Michael's, and Michael's didn't have any fabrics. And then I drove to another Michael's, and that Michael's had fabrics, but not the one that I wanted in stock. So then I had to order it online. It was a whole ordeal. But anyways, I got foam. This is some dense memory foam that's about 2 inches in thickness.
and I put our lid on top, lined it up with the edge of the foam, and try and be gentle with this because you could stretch the foam out a little bit. So I tried to do these nice fine little micro adjustments. Then I came around the sides and I traced it with a marker so I knew where I should be cutting. This sheet of plywood I cut down was some scrap that I had left over that just fit inch less on all sides from the measurement of our lid. Anyways, I used my wife's bread knife here to cut my way through the fabric. As you can see, I struggled a little bit. It kept getting caught on the edge of the last teeth of the blade. The cut was straight, but it wasn't necessarily smooth. But it didn't result in anything that you could be seen in the final results of the project. Now this was cut to size, and I took some fabric glue because I figured that would be the best choice to glue this to the wood panel. Foam is kind of like a fabric, I guess. So I started putting this on, going around the edges, and I quickly ran out of glue. So I took the lid off and tried to get the most out of it that I could, and then I was kind of panicking a bit because I didn't want the glue to set prematurely before I had enough time to actually get it onto the wood. So then I was scrambling. Spray adhesives I know will melt foam, so I couldn't use the spray adhesives that I have. And so then I went into my toolbox and I found some wood glue, and I emptied out the rest of that because I figured we're gluing this to wood, so that should work too, right? Anyways, and then I grabbed a dowel and I started to just kind of smooth it out, make sure I had nice even coverage. I was trying not to press it into the foam, but I wanted to move quick because glue will begin to set up pretty quickly if left out in the open. Glooped it all on there and flipped it over. Tried to line it up all nice and tight. And then I pressed down on it and let it cure for about an hour. And after that had cured, I flipped it over and I unraveled some batting that I also purchased. This way, when I put it down like this, I have the ability to wrap it around onto the bottom side of our bench lid seat thing. And then I took my stapler and I just stapled it down, trying to pull it taut but not too tight. I just didn't want there to be any slack left on the bottom. That's about as much as I pulled on it. Then I came and in the corners, I cut out a little 90-degree angle here on all four corners so that I could wrap the batting around without making the corners too chunky because they're going to overlap here. And then I pulled it up and I stapled it again. And what this is going to do is it's going to make the foam have a nicer rounded corner and make it look a little bit more professional than having these 90, really harsh, sharp 90-degree angle corners. And then I went around and cut out any excess because we are going to need a lot of surface area to be able to attach this to the lid of our bench. Then I got some faux leather fabric and I ordered just enough. I also thought that roll would be a little bit more satisfying to push out than it was. And I literally ordered just enough. I probably should have given myself another inch on all sides, but we made it work. So I laid it all out upside down. This is just some faux leather. And I'm just making sure to center it here, making sure that I can wrap all of my short ends and have enough space to staple it. Here on the sides, I was trying to play around with pulling it tight enough to keep it snug and secure, not have any slack, but also not pulling it too tight that you see a lot of waving and buckling and pulling of the fabric on the sides. And then I stapled it down while trying to keep an even amount of pressure and tension all the way across here. And remember, look at your sides while you're doing this. Make sure that they're staying nice and smooth and they're not starting to pull in any weird directions. And then after I did the long edges, I came around to the short edges and did another 90-degree cut like I did with the batting there. And the fold on this, I was originally thinking of trying to fold it so you get that triangle corner, but then I accidentally folded it in a way that we got a straight up and down seam there, and I liked that better. So I went with that. And it kind of looks like a burrito with this color. I might change this color to black later on, but this is what we got for now. Then I went to the other side and I tried to keep everything nice and taut. It would be nice to have a third set of hands here to help you with all of this. We did both sides, flipped it over, and there we go.
There's one spot in the corner where there was a little bit of buckling, but we'll just stick that in the back end. Then I took some E3000, which is kind of like a bonding epoxy that dries pretty quickly, and it was going great until...
Oh no.
Oh no. Oh no.
I had a butt blowout.
Anyways, I got everything all glued up, and without getting any more of that epoxy on my hands or the top of the fabric, I tried to center this on here. My wife came over and helped me with that, and we plopped it down and we let it sit for a few hours to cure. After we had let it cure, we put the lid back on, and it's looking nice and benchy. And now my wife can store her photography gear in this bench and not like tuck it under the couches and in random pockets and holes in the closets and things like that, or use our trunk as a mobile storage unit. So there you go. There's our bench.
Links for everything in this build are down in the description. Ask me any questions you have, and I'll try and reply to them in the comment section. If you're a DIYer and don't have a huge budget or a wood shop or anything like that, you're probably in the right place, because I don't either, and we're going to get into some DIY projects here in this channel. So hopefully they inspire you, teach you a few things, and yeah, you should subscribe because the video is over now.